Thanks for taking a minute to think about one of the rhetorical tangles that complicates efforts to stand up for the freedom to read. I'm Pat Lawrence, and my little corner of this issue concerns the concept of obscenity. So let me dive into this war of words and its implications. The word obscenity gets thrown around a lot in the current climate of book challenges. Pressured by activist groups, state legislatures are advancing a raft of laws that restrict obscenity or seek to extend existing restrictions into new areas. These trends shape one aspect of the broader freedom to read debate, so we should clarify what we mean when we use the term or when we hear it from others. So what does obscenity mean? The word has some very different meanings, and the slippage between these meanings can cause a lot of trouble. In popular usage, the meaning is pretty vague. Sometimes when people say obscenity, they just mean curse words or profanity or whatever you want to call it. For example, we might say someone has uttered an obscenity. As the author of a book called Obscene Gestures, I get asked about the middle finger a lot. And then, sometimes, the word is used as a synonym for excessive, but with negative moral connotations. An obscene amount is too much. In debates over restricting media, people use the word when they want to refer to something that offends their moral sensibilities. Activists use the word this way in speeches and on social media as a loaded alternative for indecent or inappropriate. When used like this, it can seem to suggest something that is offensive and that justifies suppression in a way alternatives wouldn't. In contrast, something that's obscene feels less subjective and more dangerous. Why does it have this cachet? That's because obscenity has a legal meaning, which is highly precise. That's why you get headlines like this one about how unusual it is for a book to actually be obscene, and this case from Virginia over Maya Kobabe's genderqueer was ultimately thrown out. Let's wade into the law with some basics. First, obscenity names an exception to the First Amendment. That is, the Supreme Court has declared obscenity to be a category of speech that local, state, and federal governments can restrict or suppress. And in fact, all 50 US states plus the federal government have obscenity laws. We all more or less take for granted that the First Amendment does have some limitations, and this is one of them. That's part of why it's tossed around by activists who want to limit certain kinds of speech. There's a precedent for doing so. Throughout the 20th century, publishers, prosecutors, and judges worked out the definition of obscenity in famous court battles over books like D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, James Joyce's Ulysses, and Allen Ginsberg's Howl. Then in 1973, the Supreme Court set out a test that still determines what can be legally declared obscene and therefore banned. We call this the Miller test. You can see its 3 prongs here. The first prong says the work must appeal to the prurient interest. Basically, it has to be intended to arouse the audience. The second prong says the work has to be patently offensive or obviously, clearly offensive. The last prong says the work has to have no real value to society in the realm of ideas. To be obscene, a work has to meet all 3 criteria. If it fails even one prong, it isn't legally obscene. That's a pretty narrow scope. Other parts of the Miller test narrow the scope even further. These guide how we determine prurience, offensiveness, and value. First, we should judge not by the standard of the most impressionable among us, but by average people. Second, we have to focus on what is offensive according to today's standards in the community in question, which usually doesn't mean a town, but can mean a state. Third, what counts as dangerous has to be spelled out in law before the fact. It's not enough to know it when you see it. And fourth, you can't single out one word, passage, or image to condemn the whole thing. You have to consider what it means in the context of all the other stuff in the work. All of these ensure that obscenity is only prosecuted narrowly and according to precise criteria. Under these standards, very few things are truly legally obscene. Some things do qualify, mostly abusive pornography, but the label almost never applies to literary works or popular media. Despite this decades-long effort to define the term obscenity as precisely as possible, the term is still thrown around pretty loosely in public debate over controversial works of art. So obscenity has a precise legal definition, but it gets used in vague ways. Where things get dangerous is when people who should know better confuse the issue. When obscenity is used improperly by people in power, especially prosecutors or legislators, the damage can be significant. It's one thing for lay people to use the term loosely in conversation. It's a little more worrisome when activists use the term for rhetorical impact while glossing the clearly defined legal implications of their words. And it's clearly a problem when the word is used by legislators, law enforcement, and others in positions of government authority. That's because their words can lead to costly investigations, potentially punitive legal action, and harassment of librarians, booksellers, and educators. We have numerous examples of these things happening across the country at tremendous cost, not only financially, but in damaged communities, ruined lives, and corrupted civic discourse. Obscenity charges, and the threat of them, have a broad, chilling effect, and often people who are simply exercising their First Amendment rights or protecting the freedom to read bear the social and financial burdens of defending themselves. So throwing the term around too loosely has real-world impacts, making our communities less free and less welcoming. Making things a bit more complicated, the Supreme Court left the door open to defining obscenity more broadly for minors than they do for adults. That's one big reason obscenity controversies often happen in the context of schools and libraries. For instance, my home state of South Carolina requires obscenity be defined differently for some people than for others. At the root of this is who decides what is age appropriate, a question best left to those who know a child best, but which is often weaponized against disfavored content in general. These kinds of provisions have opened the door enough for some people to exploit a potential danger to children to justify broader suppression affecting older adolescents and even adults, such as moving books out of general circulation at libraries, taking titles off sales floors at bookstores, and limiting promotion or access in other ways. But even going back to the Miller test, we find enough wiggle room that unscrupulous actors can exploit to chill speech. That's because the threat of prosecution, job loss, and funding cuts can still have the practical effect of suppressing the books in question. This all means the dangers of throwing around the word obscenity are very real. These dangers are all the more real because efforts to restrict books are hard to separate from efforts to exclude certain people. For one thing, most analyses have found that the most challenged books are those by people already outside the halls of power. When it comes to content addressing sexuality or gender, that's especially true, and obscenity has a fraught history there. As historian Whitney Strub has traced, the fact of same-sex desire was treated as legal evidence of obscenity up until the late 20th century, and it's still treated that way sometimes to this day. In addition, the current climate of aggressive book banning silences many voices before the fact. Even when these stories are shared and achieve some level of success, the terms on which they achieve success can be problematic. A reception haunted by obscenity charges can dominate the reputation of a book and overshadow its merits, not to mention resurfacing old stereotypes. For all these reasons, it matters a lot that we clarify what obscenity means and what it doesn't. But there's something else we should know. Winning the war of words isn't the same as winning the war on words. In fact, getting caught up in the semantic conversation often misses a bigger point. Here's why. Convincing someone that a book can't be banned for adults isn't the same as convincing them that the book deserves protection, and it's a far sight from convincing them that we should protect all or most forms of expression. Similarly, convincing them that the law doesn't permit what they want doesn't persuade them from wanting that. They just switch to trying to change the law. That can actually deepen the commitment of banners and challengers to legislative action where other local actions have been stymied. That's why nailing down the semantics of the issue, showing that most things aren't technically obscene, is only part of the battle. And the end of the terminological discussion is only the beginning of the ideological one. That's where things get more complicated. Basically, we begin to ask not just whether something in particular can be restricted, but the larger question of what should be restricted. There's a complicated history around this thorny debate over how much freedom of speech to tolerate. In the middle of the last century, the Supreme Court acknowledged two competing ideas at work in our culture. On the one hand, freedom of speech is immensely important. On the other hand, some restrictions remain. Since some bans are legal, the real question is how we can convince people that most bans are not a good idea. How do we convince others to accept a narrow scope of exceptions to the First Amendment and, more difficult, that tolerating things we disagree with is ultimately good? One way is to go back to those voices that seem to evoke shared American political values. One option is John Stuart Mill, whose philosophy has had a big impact on free speech discourse in the US and who remains influential in some circles today. Mill says, if all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. That's a strong statement in defense of minority opinions. We can also go all the way back to the Revolution. The founders were far from perfect, but their voices sometimes carry across political divides. Most were skeptical of restricting access to ideas and thought doing so went against the principles of liberty and democracy. There are a lot of ways to tackle the ideological battle, but often this is the real fight that a battle over terminology distracts from or delays. Let me wrap things up with a few pieces of advice for action. First, obscenity is used imprecisely to stifle disfavored opinions and shame marginalized people. Second, all people should be more precise, and those who know better should be called out for using the term in dangerous ways. Third, even so, winning the war over words won't resolve the battle over books. And finally, banners and challengers should realize their actions take freedom away from everyone and make society less equal. Thanks for listening. I'm Pat Lawrence. Good luck out there.